Hi, my name's Karen, and this is for a class, Linguistics 3470, taught at the University of Utah. It's called Language and Culture. And we're going to talk a little bit about bilingualism and what it means to be bilingual. So, the Merriam-Webster definition is that the ability to speak two languages means that somebody is bilingual. Or we could look at something like the phenomenon of children simultaneously acquiring two languages. So we often think of people being bilingual that acquired more than one language from birth. Okay. What's tricky though is that most of us have some sort of knowledge about other languages, and does just some knowledge of words or information about a language, does that make a person bilingual? Some people have an excellent command of both languages, and of course when we're talking about bilingual, we're talking about two, but this applies to multilingual as well, meaning many languages. Okay. Some people speak two languages as a child and then later lose one when they're no longer speaking that or no longer living at home with their parents. Bilingualism is really complex. It's not categorical. We can't just look at someone and say, oh, yep, they must be bilingual. It's a very complex system. Okay. So we're going to learn a bunch of new terms during this presentation about what it means to be bilingual. Okay. First of all, we have this phenomenon called balanced versus unbalanced bilingualism. So a balanced bilingual would be someone who acquires both languages simultaneously as a child. They used and heard both languages about the same, and they use those continually throughout their life, both as a child and as an adult. One of the tricky parts of this is when we think of a balanced bilingual, they have to use equal domains for both languages. And I'll give you an example of what all of the domains are, but think of it right now as the place or the social situation where the language is used. So in order for someone to be considered a balanced bilingual, they would have to use both languages from birth for their whole life, and they would have to use them about equal in equal situations. Most people are not a truly balanced bilingual, meaning that we use one language at home and then one language when we're at school or in the workplace. And that's an unbalanced bilingual. So if balance means that we use them both the same everywhere we are and for our whole lives, then unbalanced incorporates everything else. Okay? So maybe you use it for a while you're away at school, but then when you come home, you stop using that language, or you use that language only a few times when you run into a speaker who can speak that language with you. I would say this is far more common for people to be unbalanced than it is to truly be balanced. A lot of people, even at university level, may feel very comfortable in their native language in all social situations and all situations. And then they come to the United States and start learning academic vocabulary and things about their field of study in English. Often, native speakers of other languages say, no, I actually feel more comfortable talking about my academic studies in English. I don't really have the vocabulary for it in my native language. And so that person would be considered an unbalanced bilingual. Here are some terms that we need to know. Okay, we have the term heritage speaker. So a heritage speaker learns the parent's language as a child, but at some point they stop their acquisition and they never fully acquire the language. We see this happen in a lot of cases where families immigrate. They might use the language for a while, but then after a while they stop using it in favor of the new language of the place where they're living. And so children have some feelings toward the language and a connection to the language and might even be able to produce a lot of the sounds from that language that they wouldn't be able to produce if they were not learning the language from youth. But as they grow up, they kind of stop acquiring that language. They often don't feel like a proficient speaker of that language because they're not practiced in it. Okay? L1 is the first language that's acquired. So the language that you learn first, usually from your parents and family at home. L2 is your second language acquired. And really, people can have more than two languages, but we often use the term L2 to mean a language that you're acquiring. So whether it's really your L5 or your L6, we still often use the term L2 to mean that you're acquiring it a little bit later in life. Okay? A monolingual speaker is someone who only speaks one language, right? We could probably guess that based on the word mono, or the morpheme mono. And multilingual means that we speak more than one language. We, of course, can use terms that are more specific, like bilingual, trilingual, or polyglot, which means many. But we often use the term multilingual to refer to individuals who have more than one language. Okay? So we know that children can acquire more than one language. And notice here that I use the word acquire instead of learn, because when children are acquiring a language, they're not really learning it. They are just sort of soaking in all of the information. Okay? So when a child, say at home, is having one language from mom and one language from dad, they're learning both languages, or maybe mom and dad speak two. And sometimes we see a little bit of delay in their development. Okay? They're taking in a huge amount of information for their brain, and so sometimes it slows them down just a little bit in terms of their language development. But everything's okay inside their brain, and they catch up very quickly around the age of 5, sometimes around second grade. Bilinguals sometimes have a smaller vocabulary than a monolingual in the one language, and that's because they have these two languages that they're keeping a lexicon for. Okay? We also see some tentative association in bilingual children with better executive control functions. So we know that children use a little bit different part of their brain, or use their brain a little differently from monolingual children. We can actually see that light up on an MRI as their brain changes some of the things, or as the brain lights up as they're using different parts. So as a student or a child is learning the language, we can see some of the things that are going on, and we can see that they use different parts of their brain from a monolingual child of the same age. So even though we see a little bit of a delay in development, we see the children catch up, and we see some advantages in terms of their executive control function. They seem to have this understanding of two different codes. Okay? Bilingualism occurs in 3 stages. So again, we're talking about children here. Okay? The child creates 2 separate lexicons of words. Remember, the lexicon is our giant dictionary inside of our brain. And the child begins forming sentences using words from both lexicons. The child at some point will begin to segregate those words, so sentences are either from one or the other. And the syntax begins to separate around age 4. So I've had people who are raising their children bilingually ask me questions about if their children are going to have mixed up language forever, because they hear the child putting in the words of one language and the syntax of another. And the answer is no. Your child figures that all out miraculously, actually in a pretty short time period. So we know that children can acquire many, many languages as children, as many as they're exposed to on a regular basis. And so if you're feeling concerned about your child who's a little slow because they're processing multiple languages, just keep at it, because they'll catch up. Okay. Well, how common is it? We live in the United States, and so it's a little less common here than it is in other parts of the world. Okay. Worldwide, we have between 6,000 and 7,000 languages, and there are only 192 countries. That means that we have many more languages than we do countries. Okay. And in fact, there are more people in the world who are bilingual than monolingual. So growing up here in Utah, many of the people that I met were monolingual, or maybe they learned a language on their mission and could speak that language, especially about church terms, but might struggle to communicate about, say, politics. So an example of an unbalanced bilingual. So my view of the world was that lots of people probably were monolingual in the world. But as I get to know other countries and other places, it's far more common for someone to speak one language growing up in their home, and then to change that language as they go to school, and maybe even change that language again as they move to a city nearby for their business. And so they start to use all of these languages regularly in their life. Okay? There are more non-native English speakers than native English speakers in the world. There's around 360 million native speakers versus 430 million non-native speakers. So as English has grown throughout the world, we actually have way more people speaking it as a second or third or fifth language than we do as a first language. And 21% of people in the US speak a language other than English at home. So we do have a large population, or a large percentage of the population, still a minority, that speaks more than one language at home. And of course, when we're asking this question, it gets a little tricky to answer because some people might answer, well, yes, I say a few sentences each time my grandma comes over to my house. And so I use another language in my home. It's hard to capture the data of exactly how much people are using those languages in their home. In Utah, we estimate about 15% of the people speak a language other than English, and 9% of those people are speaking Spanish. Okay. If we look at other countries, the numbers change quite drastically. So in South Africa, they have 11 official languages. 5 most common are, and you can see the percentages of who speaks these languages. Okay, what's interesting is that when you make something an official language, then you almost always have all of your government documents translated into those languages. That means that in South Africa, when they're doing things for the government, they're often translating things into many languages. So it's very possible to have that work in a society. We see that in Switzerland as well. Okay. In India, we have 15 languages classified as major languages, okay? But there's some 387 total languages in the country of India. In Kenya, we have some 61 languages. And in Papua New Guinea, which is a very tiny one half of an island, we estimate that there are close to 1,000 languages. And this is a pretty densely populated area, so it's very interesting that we could still have this many languages survive. Okay. Now, when we talk about bilingualism and try to determine whether or not someone is bilingual or whether or not they're just using, some words from that language, it has to do with their competence. Okay. True bilinguals have a grammatical competence, a textual competence, an illocutionary competence, and a sociolinguistic competence. Okay. But the competence levels vary in terms of their performance. So when we talk about competence versus performance, okay, lots of people make mistakes when they're speaking. In fact, in this presentation, I've made several mistakes or false starts where I've had to start over in terms of, partway through a sentence and then I pause and then I start again. That doesn't mean that I don't know English. It means that I have issues where sometimes I can't think of the right word, or maybe I get nervous, and those would be performance errors. Competence errors deal with what we really know inside of our brain. So for grammatical competence, we're talking about the core components of the grammar. And remember, we're talking about the grammar that exists inside your head, not the grammar that is the rules that we study when we're in school. Okay? The grammar includes phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics. So when I say that I know a language, or I know the grammar of the language, I'm really talking about all of these things. And if I really know the language, then I should be able to effectively put sentences together in correct ways, and I should also be able to judge whether or not another sentence is correct or not. So we've talked about how native speakers can make grammaticality judgments to determine whether a sentence is correct or not according to the components of the grammar. Okay, so here are some examples. We have 1A and B. A unicorn that is eating a flower is in the garden. And B, a unicorn is eating a flower is in the garden. If you're a native speaker of English, you should have some sort of intuition that tells you that 1A is acceptable while 1B is not. What's interesting is that these sentences are quite similar when we look at the number of words and the placement of words. We have the difference of having the relative pronoun that inserted as we move the clause into that spot after unicorn. So something inside of our head tells us that in order to put those two clauses together, a unicorn eating a flower and a unicorn is in the garden, in order to put those two clauses together, we have to use a relative pronoun to combine them. Okay, that's part of our grammatical competence. Now, that doesn't mean we can explain it. We just know that we can do that. And we see people, even very young children, make these types of sentences without error on a regular basis. Here's another example. She told me a little white lie will come back to haunt me. Or B, she told me that a little white lie will come back to haunt me. Well, this one's interesting. It's quite a bit similar to what we saw in 1A and 1B. In one case, we have the relative pronoun that, and in one case, we don't. Okay? What's different about these sentences, though, is we have, again, two clauses. The first clause, she told me a little white lie, and she told me, or it will come back to haunt me. And in this case, when we are putting them together, we don't have to have the relative pronoun. It's optional. So not only can we tell that both 2A and 2B are acceptable sentences, but we also somehow know that in some cases we need the relative pronoun, and in other cases we don't. Okay? Whew. Let's talk about textual competence. Okay? Textual competence is the knowledge about well-formedness that's above the sentence level. So when we're talking about the grammatical competence, we're looking really at sentence level grammar. And by grammar, again, I really mean that is this sentence acceptable in that language or not? Okay? Textual competence is something a little bit larger than that. It has to do with how we put sentences together to make well-formed text. Okay? Here we go. So MGs can be very temperamental. See, I relate everything to grammar. MGs can be very temperamental. MGs won't start if they are wet. When they work, MGs are fun to drive. They do not work often. Okay? Versus number 2. Like most roadsters, MGs can be very temperamental. For example, they won't start if they're wet. However, on the rare days when they work, they are fun to drive. Okay? When we listen to these sentences, if we look at the grammatical level, if we look at the sentence level of number 1, there's nothing really wrong with the sentence. But as we're putting these sentences together, again, we have some sort of intuition. Part of our knowledge of the language tells us that number 2 is quite a bit more acceptable, or quite a bit better, might be a word to use, than the other paragraph number 1. So that also exists somewhere inside of our head. Now, in this case, we often have been directly taught sort of how to put those things together. But there are things that we do long before we're taught about how to put sentences together, where children can tell a story without ever being able to write it down, and no one's really told them how to put all those things together to make a good story. Okay? Illocutionary competence is the ability to comprehend a speaker's intent and to produce a variety of sentence types to convey a particular intent in various circumstances. So it really means that there are ways that we can convey things, but we also understand things in different ways. So we've talked before a little bit about pragmatics and how we might mean something a little bit different from what the structure of the sentence says. Okay, so we can say it's hot in here, but we might mean something like turn up the AC, don't leave the ice cream out or it will melt, or we might just mean, hey, it's kind of warm in here. So we have the understanding when we know a language that we can understand all of these different scenarios. Okay. Another thing that we talk about, if I can go back for a second, another thing we talk about with illocutionary competence is sometimes as a native speaker I may not remember the right word, but I can talk around it to get to the right term. So I have many options available to me to say the same thing. Okay. Sociolinguistic competence has to do with the ability to produce and comprehend a variety of social dialects and registers. We really haven't talked about register yet in this class, but register has to do with the language we use in an informal setting versus a formal setting. So something like if I invite my boyfriend over for dinner to meet my grandmother, I might introduce him differently than if I invite him over to meet my best friends, or if I invite him over to meet my boss. So in each of those social situations, we have an understanding of sort of the type of language and the register that we should use. Okay? We could call those things social dialects as well. So here are a couple of examples. So in number 1, I assume we will be working late again this evening. What a shame. Versus number 2, we got to work late again. Damn it. We probably aren't going to say both of these things to our boss. Maybe we say number 1 to our boss, but number 2 seems to be a much more informal type of sentence that we would say more when we're with friends and coworkers who would feel the same as us. Okay? So we have those 4 different types of competencies: grammatical, illocutionary, textual competence, and sociolinguistic competence. So we have the 4 different types of competence, but I mentioned already that we might have variation in performance. Okay? So we can be very competent but suffer a performance error. This is my very favorite linguistic term. I've told you a couple of different times of words that I really like. I love the word diphthong, and I love the word fricative, but this is actually my very favorite linguistic term, and I learned it pretty early on in my linguistics career. So there's this phenomenon called a spoonerism, where we move the onset of one syllable to the onset of one syllable in a word to the onset of another syllable in a word. So it might be that we switch words, or it might be word internal. So something like if I say, oh, I just hit my bunny phone, but I really meant to say I hit my funny bone. But I switched the f sound and the b sound, okay? And that's a spoonerism. Performance errors can be due to stress, fatigue, alcohol, and sometimes extreme emotions, right? So I think of like when my child is crying, really upset over something, and they can't get any words out because they're trying so hard to get the words out, but they're crying. They just can't get anything out. Okay? So performance errors have nothing to do with our competence or our ability to understand and know those things inside of our grammar box. Okay. Whew, that's a lot of terms already. Let's see, we've talked about balanced and unbalanced, multilingual, monolingual, bilingual, trilingual. We've also talked about the 4 competencies. Okay, so let's talk about some other things that have a role in talking about what it means to be bilingual. Bilinguals may not be equally competent in both languages. Okay, so here we're talking about an unbalanced bilingual. I may not be able to discuss all domains of life. So I might feel more comfortable at home speaking in Spanish, but when I'm talking about school things or work things, I feel more comfortable in English because that's the way I've practiced my language that way. Maybe I feel more competent in one language discussing politics, and it's a struggle for me to discuss it in both languages. Okay? And skill in one domain may not translate to a skill in another. So I might be able to read in one, but not be able to read in a second language. Or maybe I can read in my second language, but not in my first language. And sociolinguistic competence, knowing the styles, the registers, the discourse customs, that is something that is important as we're looking at people who are bilingual. Okay? So, when do you use which language? Well, languages can have specific domains. Here are some domains of language use. Family, friends, religion, employment, education, hobbies, politics, government, law. So people can be an unbalanced bilingual, and they might use one language in one domain and a different language in a different domain. A balanced bilingual would be able to use both languages in every domain and would use them approximately equally throughout their life. It's also possible to have somebody who can do a language in one of these domains but does not consider themselves to be bilingual. So perhaps maybe for religion, you use a language that goes just with your religion, but it's not something that you could talk about in that language. You couldn't talk about employment, for example. Okay, let's talk about code switching. So code switching, code switching occurs when bilinguals, so people who are fully competent in both languages, substitute a word or a phrase from one language with the word or a phrase from another language. Notice that I'm talking about people who are truly competent in the language. I'm not saying that somebody who fills in a word from English as they're learning Spanish because they just don't have a big enough Spanish vocabulary. That's not quite the same thing I'm talking about here. True code switching occurs with people who understand and can utilize both codes very well. And when they code switch, they're putting things in for a couple of different reasons. Okay? It's important for you to know that it often follows the rules of both languages. So they have to have those competencies in place in order for them to effectively code switch. Okay? So I might say something like this. I want a motorcycle verde. Okay, so here we have the Spanish adjective, and it's obeying the Spanish syntax, which shows that we have a clear understanding of Spanish itself because we're putting it in the Spanish syntactic order, but we might switch to the Spanish word for a variety of reasons. Okay? We used to think that code switching came from a lack of linguistic competence, but the more it's been studied, the more we understand that people actually use code switching who have a full command of the languages. So here are some reasons why we might code switch. We can code switch as we go from an informal to a formal situation. Okay. We might do it to exert control. This is probably the one I see most common, is that when a child is misbehaving and the parent first starts out in English, but then when the child is not responding, the parent switches to Spanish or to another language to indicate that I'm really serious about this. And the child often knows that when you switch to that language, right, that's the language you listen to mom and dad in, and you better do what they say. It has a similar effect to sometimes monolingual parents or bilingual parents might use a child's middle name to indicate that they really need their attention. Okay? So we can use code switching to exert control. Okay? We also can do it to align speakers with others in specific situations. We might use it to distance ourselves or to draw ourselves closer to someone else. Okay? We might use it to announce specific identities. Ooh, sorry, I just did a little swap right there. And we might do it to create certain meanings. I have friends who often code switch between Spanish and English, and it sort of allows them a larger choice for how they might define something. Okay? And sometimes it has to do with facilitating particular interpersonal relationships. So code switching or switching to one language or another might be used to gain a closer relationship with someone. Okay. Code switching can also occur between dialects. So people can be bidialectal as well. In fact, most people are bidialectal, or at least bi-register, right? We have different registers that we use throughout our day or throughout different domains. Okay? So we might have some examples of people who at home speak a variety of Black English, African American Vernacular English, or Ebonics. And we might have people who speak some sort of regional dialect versus their academic English. So if I grew up in Harlem in New York, I might sound one way on the basketball court. Sorry, I'm not a basketball player. On the basketball court with my friends. But then after I've gone to Harvard to law school, while I'm working, I might sound very different. But again, when I go home to visit my old buddies, I might go back to that regional variety. Okay. So here are some reasons why we might code switch. Okay. These are considered socio-pragmatic functions. Okay. We might switch because we have available to us two lexicons, and sometimes one lexicon doesn't seem to have the right fit in terms of vocabulary. And so by switching to the other language, I might be able to more adequately describe the thing that I'm trying to say. Okay. One thing that it often involves is kinship terms. Okay. We can also have a trigger, so where we say a specific word and it triggers a switch for the rest of the clause or the rest of the sentence. Sometimes when we're quoting someone else, okay, and sometimes to elaborate or further explain an idea. Idioms, we've talked about idioms in our class before. Idioms do not transfer very well. Okay. We also can use it for emphasis, and sometimes we have a free code switch where we're not really sure exactly why it happens, but it might be for stylistic reasons or to highlight the fact that I can. So people can code switch for a number of reasons. Okay. Now, as we talk about communities can be bilingual too, okay? Meaning that one or more language is used in different domains in the community, right? So there are lots of reasons to be bilingual, and it often has to do with communicating in your community with more than one language. Okay, so the social context of bilingualism affects how and how often each language is used. So we might have a bilingual society of mostly monolingual individuals, so all of the people inside the society are mostly only one language speakers, or we might have a bilingual society where it's mostly bilingual speakers. Okay? So two groups of people are each associated with a particular language, and relatively few people speak both. Okay? So this is the monolingual individuals, but bilingual society. Okay? So maybe in one part of the country, we speak this language A, and in the other part of the country, we speak language B. And we rarely interact with each other, and so we rarely speak each other's language. But the society as a whole is considered bilingual because we're using two languages there. Okay, most famous examples are where language differences have been a conflict, right? So we've got the Quebecois and English in Quebec. We've got the Flemish and French in Belgium, which is an asymmetrical bilingualism. So if you speak one language, you're likely to speak the other, but if you speak the higher dialect, then you're less likely to speak what's considered kind of the lower dialect. So, and lower and higher just has to do with the political status often and the economic status, and in terms of how many speakers it would connect you to in the world. That is not a personal judgment on my part. Again, all languages equal in my eyes, and I think it's great to know as many languages as you can. Okay. A region could be officially bilingual, but nearly monolingual in practice. So the Republic of Ireland, both Irish and English are official languages. They have them on road signs and in government documents, but only one is taught in school. Okay? And only a small proportion of the population speaks it as a native language. Okay? The goal of the Irish official status is to help confirm the Irish identity, okay? And to try to reverse the loss of speakers. And it can be a real hot button for people in terms of deciding what language to give status and what language not to give status, and whether or not it actually helps to give status. Okay? Let's talk about bilingual societies where the individuals inside the society are also bilingual. Okay? Many places, this is the norm. Okay? There are parts of the world that are so diverse that you just have to know more than one language. Africa and India are common examples where you grow up at home speaking a local language, but another one at the regional level to communicate with your neighbors, especially for trade and economic reasons, and maybe in school. But then you have a colonial language such as English or French that's used in higher education and business. So again, with the idea of kind of being an unbalanced bilingual, if you speak a local dialect, you're far more likely to speak the three languages than if you're born in one of these areas speaking English or French, where you may be able to get by your whole life just speaking English or French, and you would never have to learn the local dialects. Okay. Speakers often choose in these societies what is appropriate for the context. Okay, so it depends on what languages we have in common, and the whole point of a regional language is to facilitate communication. Choosing a regional or national language over the local allows me to demonstrate my formality. Okay, so I know that you're from a different area, so I'm going to speak the language that we have in common as I'm working with you. Okay. In my neighborhood, I have a family where the father is from the Ivory Coast, and the mother is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so mom speaks a Congolese dialect, and dad speaks an Ivory Coast dialect. I'm not even sure what exactly to call the dialect, but they both grew up speaking a language at home. And then later, as they went to school, they both learned French. So their common language that they often communicate with one another in is French, because both of them learned that as the lingua franca of that area. But when mom is speaking with her mother, then she uses her Congolese dialect that they always spoke at home. The children growing up in the United States are very proficient at English, French, and some of the dialects that are spoken at home. They're more proficient in mom's Congolese dialect because they hear mom and grandma speaking it than they are in dad's dialect from the Ivory Coast, although they are familiar with commands and things for that as well. So here's an example where in their house they might choose different languages for different reasons. Sometimes the grandma, who does not speak any English, who is very, very old, if the children want to speak to her, they can't pick English. They have to communicate with her in French or in the Congolese dialect. And since they're not as proficient in the Congolese dialect, it's mostly used around household things and kind of commands that parents give children or cooking things, then the children often use French when they want to communicate with grandma. Okay. So diglossia is a term that we use to describe a situation where two different varieties co-occur throughout the speech community. Each has a distinct range of social function. So we have two languages that are used, but they're used for specific purposes. Okay. It often comes from colonialism or slavery, so where one language is sort of imposed on a group of people. It results in different language situations. Okay. They might be dialects of one language, or they might be two distinct languages. Okay. And the languages are used with distinct functions. So you might use one for trading and business, or one for school, but a different language is used at home or when you're out in the fields working. Okay. We can see this also happen in a community where there are three languages spoken that each have their specific functions. Okay. We classify languages as either high or low, where we end up in a diglossic situation. The high variety is not usually the native variety. It's usually learned in addition to the native variety. Okay. The low variety is the regional or local dialect. And again, kind of the reason that we use high or low has more to do with the upward mobility in terms of economics. Again, not because there's something actually low or bad about that dialect. Okay, all languages are able to take on every domain and can expand to meet whatever needs speakers need. But often the high variety comes into play because the individuals themselves need that language to better their economic circumstances. Okay, so here are some examples. Okay, and again, it can be dialects of the same language, or it can be two different languages. Okay, so the high language is perceived, okay, it's not actually true, but it's perceived to be more logical, elegant, superior, and usually is standardized with some sort of formal instruction. Okay. Often we have some sort of literary heritage where we have a written dialect. And we usually learn that not from our mother's knee, so to speak, not in our home. We learn that a little bit later as we go to school. Okay. The high variety is used for formal situations. Okay. Here are some examples. Here are some examples of the high variety, and that's what they're mainly used for. The lower variety is used for other functions, so much more personal settings. Instructions to waiters, servants, workmen, conversations with family and friends, anything that comes from the past, talk shows. Okay, and the use of the low is inappropriate in some situations. And when you make a mistake, it often can be embarrassing to you to use the wrong language. Okay. So to go back over some of the things that we've talked about, we have a huge number of vocabulary terms we've talked about. Okay. We've talked about types of bilinguals, balanced or unbalanced or a heritage speaker. Remember, the heritage speaker is the speaker who learns some of the language, their native language, but then the acquisition is incomplete. Sometimes they come back to the language later, like when they go to college or when they decide to move back to kind of a homeland. But at some point the acquisition stopped. Domains of language use. We talked about different domains like education, home, family, religion, politics, and how we might use a different language in different settings. We talked about areas of competency, where we are, in order to be considered competent at a language or to be bilingual, we have to be competent in 2 languages. We have to understand the grammatical competence, the textual competence, the illocutionary competence, and the sociolinguistic competence. Okay, diglossia was the situation where we have we have societies that are bilingual, meaning that more than one language is used in society at the society level, but perhaps at the individual level it could be monolingual or it could be bilingual at the individual level. And we talked about code switching. The important thing to remember about code switching is that there are a variety of reasons why one might switch codes, but in fact they're fully able to use both of those codes. They're competent in both codes in order to be very proficient at code switching. It's not a lack of abilities in one language or another.